The West is very much confused when it comes to dealing with China, because China has changed things so far from the way it was when we all had hopes of a sunny uplands future with win-win solutions for everybody, and that somehow or other, eventually, after a few years working out how capitalism operated, China would become politically more liberal. This, of course, never happened. Nor was it ever going to, because it remains, and they imagine they always will be, a Marxist-Leninist regime which is engaged in permanent struggle with everything which opposes their interests, and that means the West. So right from the word go, that regime, as it is configured from ideologically, politically, militarily, economically, in terms of influence and power operations, in terms of its diplomacy, is trying to ensure Communist Chinese Party victory over the Western Alliance. And what is more dramatic now, they have, for expedient reasons, hooked up with the Russians. And if we don't understand that our enemy's friend is our enemy, we are missing a very big trick. So when I hear people talking about deepening cooperative relationships with China and engaging our trade connections, what I hear them saying is getting more exposed to a threat and making it a bigger risk, both politically, militarily, and economically. And why would you want to do that? The main thing to realize is that unlike the West, which tends to try to stovepipe different aspects of its government powers like defense and economics and political, for the Chinese Communist Party, that is a single narrative. And as a result, we cannot separate our economic relations with China from all the rest of what goes with that package. You cannot have a mutually advantageous economic relationship with China unless the military relationship with China, the political relationship, and in every other way the relationship is also advantageous. And we all know that it is not. So we've had George Robertson, tasked recently by the Prime Minister to produce an absolutely fundamental review of defense, saying that China, together with its partner states, the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans, poses a deadly threat to the UK. And that is true. And that, I think, really should be the starting point for our discussion of this issue. I think this makes a very good point. You can go and invest in China and hope to make some good of it. And indeed, some companies over the years have done so. But if the Chinese government decides to do as I've just described, which is to take advantage of economic leverage and dependency, it will do so viciously and with very little notice. So from that point of view, business is looking to governments for a steer as to what the risk might be. Recently, it seems that our own government has said that we should not describe China as a threat in parliamentary contexts. Well, this is a very strange thing to do, and what I've said about Russia and the arming and supporting economically of Russia by China is taken into account. And if we're not even allowed to say it's a threat, what chances are there of us waking up in a timely manner? And how can we call that a proper government policy led by responsible leaders? There are some people who really have spent a long time thinking hard about China, who still really dislike the idea that we should treat them, or can even think of treating them, as an axis. But we have got to do so. This is not an axis that exists because the West, with superior power and an active policy of containment or deterrence, has been forcing China into alliance with its Russian friends and its North Korean friends and its Iranian friends. Those friendships are long, deep, and they have been nurtured for many years. We have just preferred not to think about it. So from that point of view, there is no question that we are creating a Cold War by beginning to think that that might be a problem. And as I said, George Robertson, who knows a thing or two about statesmanship and international affairs, described them as a deadly quartet. That is the reality. Now, we've all got our own views about Iran. We've got separate thoughts about North Korea, and we've had until lately separate thoughts about Russia. But unless we start gluing all those pieces together, it's no longer a jigsaw which we can separate and ignore. This is a big, bright picture staring us in the face. So we've got to get our heads around that, and we've got to work out what to do about it. And the next thing to do is to recognize that it's expedient, it's not set in stone, it's very fluid, it's organic and dynamic. We need to be agile in the same sort of way, and to think in the same sort of way about dividing and addressing issues head on and also together as the basis for a shared policy, so that what happens in Washington and in Brussels and in London, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and everywhere else where there are states of good faith that believe in the international rules-based order, that we have a coherent response and don't allow ourselves to be split apart, which the Chinese are extremely good at. The Russians are more disruptive, the Chinese are more strategic, but they are basically now hooked up together. And there's a force multiplier there that we've got to match and exceed. Clearly, companies that built up over the years very successful business relationships in China and states of dependency that exists in terms of supply chains, all of these things are going to be painful to eradicate. But the consequences of not doing so are far worse. If we stick to the very simple definition of what is a risk, which is where there's hostile intention, we know that's clear, it's absolutely clear. We know that there's hostile capability, which is increasing very dramatically. And here I will mention, which is possibly the most important thing, how can you call China a status quo power when it is increasing its military strength at a speed and with degrees of competence that have not been seen either by the Germans in World War II or the Russians in the Cold War? Nobody else for many years has been proliferating nuclear weapons to the extent that at the moment they're already calling question the existing balance of nuclear power. That is not a steady state. That is a state which is out there to change the world order in every aspect, starting with the most dangerous kinetic capability. The West has yet to find a common voice. There are various international institutions such as the Quad and so on, which have the makings of it, but they take a while to gun up. Just as we all know, the Australian submarine angle is a very important one and a very significant and I think a very worthwhile gesture, but it is a bit of a gesture as long as the rest of the world is divided between the Americans, who can be dismissed by China as having essentially a unilateral make America great and the rest of the world can go hang agenda, with tariffs essentially being a bilateral trade war. That doesn't work. Biden's done a great deal to change that. He's done a great deal to get out and try and forge this unity of nations. But the difficulty is it's like herding cats. The minute you get the kinds of political instability that we've been seeing in Europe and in Britain too, you find that people fall back on a sense of what the national interests are, which are very well modified by Chinese engagement of the sort that you've been describing. People suddenly say, a lot of the people who are closest to China here say, come on now, look, we have these dependencies that you mentioned. They exist. We can't do it. These are difficult times. The world's in a parlor state. Why on earth would you want to engage in things that involve that level of pain? Well, as I say, there is a far greater danger in not doing so. When you manage risk, you think about capability, intention, and exposure. And now is the time to reduce exposure. We can't change their capabilities. They've got that. They've got their hypersonic missiles. They've got their new warheads being built. They've got their new submarine systems. They've got an attitude which links up with Russia in the same sphere. We can't change that. What we can change is our exposure to some degree. And doing that involves proactive, timely, and shared common policies which act to deter. That's where we must work together.
The West is playing a very different economic game to China. As far as the West is concerned, it's business as usual in the main. And what I mean by that is it's companies competing against each other. The most profitable, the most innovative, the most efficient company wins. That's the game that the West has been playing for quite a few decades. China plays a different game. For China, it's not about the most profitable and most efficient wins. It's about dominating markets, supply chains, materials, inputs, and it doesn't matter so much to the Chinese system whether the companies are the most efficient companies as long as they're Chinese. So from that point of view, the Chinese are playing a far more nationalistic, mercantilist game, and the West is playing a much more liberal economic game. So in that sense, the West is starting to realize that, but it hasn't quite worked out what to do about it. The transfer of technology legitimately or illegitimately happens in a number of ways. The first way is that, and the most egregious way, is that China will just steal it. So it will steal it through cyber means. It will steal it through foreign companies doing business in China. So it's just out and out theft. That's the most obvious and egregious way. It's not the only way, though. The second way is that when Western companies have, or any foreign company does business in China, if it's in what the Chinese consider a strategic or important or critical sector, they will force that company to do business in China through a joint venture with a Chinese company. And the record consistently shows that when you do that over a matter of years, that technology and know-how is transferred, sometimes legitimately, sometimes illegitimately, into Chinese companies. And once it goes to Chinese companies, the Chinese government has the authority or the ability to force the Chinese company to spread it to other Chinese companies. So the idea being that the government in Beijing wants to create an ecosystem in China which dominates that particular sector, that particular technology. So once again, they're playing a very different game to what the West is playing. But the best way I can describe this is to look at what happened with solar panels. 15 years ago, solar panels, the most advanced solar panels were developed in Europe and the United States. And what the Chinese did was that they lured a lot of these companies to set up manufacturing plants in China because a lot of these plants are cheaper, they're subsidized and so on. The technology was transferred into the Chinese tech ecosystem, and then the Chinese government subsidized Chinese companies to sell solar panels to the rest of the world at prices around 80% beneath the market price. So obviously the Western companies then went out of business, and that allowed China to dominate supply chain. So you have the situation now where China dominates 95% of solar panel production in the world. And I would emphasize that that is not a market outcome. That was an outcome engineered by the government through both intellectual property theft and subsidization of Chinese companies. Now, that's just one technology or sector. The concern now is that China has now identified a whole host of technological and other advanced and strategic sectors that they want to do exactly the same thing too. So I think the United States and Europe has caught on to that. But it's, we don't, our governments in these Western countries don't have the same sorts of powers to force companies to make longer term decisions. So that I think is a challenge for Western economies, Western governments, and Western firms. If you look at German manufacturing and engineering companies, for example, they're facing this dilemma now because there's obviously a short-term benefit being the Chinese market and doing joint ventures with Chinese partners and manufacturing in China, but they know that in 10 years' time, they probably will lose their advantage. But the problem is that private companies often think very short-term rather than long-term. Whether Trump becomes president or whether it's Kamala Harris, I'm very confident, very certain that the America First type policies, especially with respect to China, will occur under either Democrats or Republicans, simply because it's become pretty obvious that the United States cannot afford the level of technology transfer and manufacturing loss to the Chinese for their own self-interest. With Europe, I don't think Europe is as advanced on that on that continuum of protecting your long-term interest, but you are seeing signs of that, and you are seeing at least diplomacy and rhetoric coming out of Europe recognizing that problem, even though they haven't gone as far as the Americans yet in having all-out tech and tariff wars with the Chinese. If you look at trade in normals, I guess non-high-tech goods, that continues on as normal just because there's no alternative for China. They make most of the stuff that we need. But when you look at trade in high-tech goods with China, either trade into China or trade from China, that is falling significantly between China and all advanced economies for the reasons that I outlined. So I do expect trade in technology with China to decrease. And for a lot of Western countries, the UK or Europe, even if they don't want to buy into this problem that I'm talking about, at the same time, they don't want to be caught by secondary sanctions. So they don't want to be caught by sanctions that the United States imposes onto China and companies that do business with China, and which would bar them from accessing the American market or the American capital markets. So the United States, in my view, still has quite a lot of leverage because it's still the number one source of capital in the world. In a lot of major categories, it is actually still a source of advanced technology in the world, even though China is the major manufacturing power. So the United States can actually compel other advanced economies to make that choice. And I think that will increasingly happen over time. If the Western economies are not successful at finding other manufacturing centers, then yes, certainly it will be passed on to the consumer. What I would say, though, is that Western governments, not just the American, but increasingly the UK and European governments, they are starting to price in a security premium, if you like, into the cost of things. So things won't be as cheap as before, but we are in a world where choosing one ecosystem over the other for geopolitical reasons is just an unavoidable choice.